Hi, everybody. Welcome to a new and exciting topic, work physiology, and topic 13 we have here. And we have three subtopics in this topic. But first of all, what do we mean by work physiology? I mean work in the physics sense, force times distance, and the ability for a human to produce work, force over a distance, requires energy. And so how does food and liquid and oxygen turn into kinetic energy? That is what we're talking about in this topic. All right, so this is important in the human factors world because humans have to perform work in this sense, and heavy work. They have to produce large forces or long distances or for long periods of time. The types of domains we're interested in, a lot of times construction, but any place where you're doing repetitive sorts of activities, and you're working up a sweat, and by the end of the day you're tired, you're sore. Also, one of the characteristics of these jobs often is there's not a whole lot of time or flexibility for taking breaks. And so this picture I have here, I think this is called a column cap that's being, installed for a highway. And I have a good friend who is, he worked for several years with the Department of Transportation, the Texas Department of Transportation, and worked on highway construction, and kind of, gave me the lowdown on some of the intense moments in which, it costs quite a bit of money to, to lay concrete when you're suspended up in the air, 100 feet and in dangerous conditions. But you pour concrete, and then you got to get that spread out really quickly, and there is no rest. You can't stop. You got to get it done, or it's a catastrophic cost, to have to start over. So yeah, things like laying concrete, and then my friend's case of laying concrete in treacherous, hazardous situations can be even that much more time critical, or the work needs to get done. Even if you really, really want to take a break, it's the motivation is to keep going. Okay, so from the human factors perspective, historically, if you take the Taylorist approach of thinking, it's let's have the right pieces go into the puzzle. So hire big, strong people like this guy, provide physical health benefits, physical fitness training and tests, for example, but then also make it easier, so the humans don't have to be as much of the source of that work, with certain types of tools, and hey, do the tool, perform the activity in this way because it'll minimize your risk of injury. Sometimes you say it's just a tough job and someone's got to do it, so let's just pay people enough to make it worthwhile. And then rotation is another option. So hopefully, if you're working at a construction site, you're not only the sledgehammer guy, because otherwise you're going to be working exclusively or extensively certain muscle groups at the cost of others. And so if you rotate jobs, that's one way to prevent too much risk there. A more modern way to think about this, and so I always want to encourage people to think about the human-centered systems aspects, right? And so to recognize the human's going to be the center of this work, what can we put around the human to make the tasks that they would need to perform easier? Let's take the aspects that machines can do really well, like produce force, and make that be produced by a machine that is a tool that the human uses. So, finding ways to produce more force, or to produce a certain amount of force over, a distance. These are what machines do in the simplest sense. And now we have, advanced sorts of tools that can be used for, for a lot of these aspects of the heavy work. Okay, so here we go. Subtopic 13.1. First, we're going to talk about how, the basics of muscles, about muscles that produce work, and then the metabolic cycle, just an introduction to it, in terms of how the human body supplies the energy that is necessary to have muscles contract and then ultimately have force and work output. Okay, so we're primarily, well, really only interested in one type of muscle, but there are three. So smooth muscle for, our internal organs, and cardiac muscle, which is unique to the heart. Each of these don't have conscious, at least not direct conscious control. So I can't, consciously contract my stomach, for example, but I might have a thought that causes a reaction in my, subconscious autonomous system that affects the muscles of my stomach. No, so what we're interested in this course and this topic is skeletal muscle. These are consciously controllable, so they are innervated by motor neurons. And so when we talked about topic 10, motor control topics, these are the muscles that are activated by those motor programs. About 40% of our body weight are these skeletal muscles. Okay. Excuse me. All right. So going back to this definition of work as we would in physics class, which is a force applied over a distance, we need to say, okay, well, the source of the force, if the human is acting, are contracting muscles. And so we need energy input to result in that muscle contraction, which is a kinetic energy output. And this is generally going to be mostly from chemical input, like from food, right? So metabolism, this is the sum total of all the chemical reactions, processes, the energy transformations, chemical energy, potential energy, kinetic energy. Humans are constantly transforming those things: heat energy, thermal energy, of course. All of those combined, this is the general concept of metabolism. So we have inputs and outputs, the inputs being food, fatty acids, and from each of those we can extract the chemical aspects that are needed to produce ultimately the chemical reactions in contraction, which we'll show you in a video here coming soon. But then oxygen is another key part of human metabolism. Interesting thing is that it's not an absolute requirement, because we have means of producing energy internally through our internal metabolic processes that don't involve oxygen, but they're much more costly to our body, and I'll explain how that goes. So in general, having oxygen present is a key feature of having an efficient metabolic system. If you're mowing the lawn, make sure you're also breathing oxygen. There we go. All right, good. So and then in 13.3, we're going to talk more about different levels of metabolic activity, but in general, we're interested in how the human factors workplace, I should say, impacts, it translates to these metabolic sorts of processes. So we want to remember that we have to have a certain amount of, fire going in the pit just to stay alive. So we have our baseline metabolic rate. I think it's something like 1,200 kilocalories a day, and you can also think of that as 1,200 calories, and I'll explain why. But 1,200 kilocalories. And then on top of that, we need whatever we need to perform work. So if I just lay like a slob all day, I may get away with only eating, a candy bar a day to keep up, or otherwise, hopefully I have some stored body fat, which can also be a source of energy. All right. Yeah, and then just, another diagram showing the inputs and outputs and transformations. So food and oxygen come in. They are propagated through our internal systems here. Ultimately, the food and energies are extracted and used, through the metabolic processes in our metabolism organ. And we have some, internal energy consumed by our organs, etc. Some external energy, contraction and muscular work. We also have heat as a byproduct of this reaction also. And so when we exhale, we are also, some of the heat that comes in as chemical energy is released as thermal energy. We also exhale water and carbon dioxide, and this is key because carbon dioxide is the indicator of, that's the byproduct of our primary means of metabolism. So if you are exhaling carbon dioxide, it means your engine is running. If you're not exhaling carbon dioxide, it means the engine is off, okay? So it's actually an interesting thing, but anesthesiologists, medical professionals, if they have a patient under anesthesia, what they do to make sure they're alive, one of the key indicators is what they call a capnograph, which is measuring the carbon dioxide content of their exhaled breath. So for each breath, is my patient okay? One of the main things they're looking at is the pattern of exhalation, and the content of carbon dioxide, because that means the body is still metabolizing, the inputs, and it's still running appropriately. Okay, right. So let's talk about let's get down to the microscopic aspects of the muscle, and where the energy conversion takes place. So I hope you'll recognize, this is, one of the large, what we call a muscle, I guess just a muscle, but, we have muscles, we have muscle groups. This is a quantity of muscular tissue that is enough to move a part of my skeleton, okay? But look at, we're going to keep getting smaller and smaller here. So we have, bundles of bundles of bundles, and we get down to a muscle fiber. And then even that is bundles of myofibrils and filaments. And here we go, actin and myosin, that's as far as I wanted to get. So the smallest unit of machine, essentially in a skeletal muscle, is the attractive and repulsive and connected chemical bonds between actin and myosin. And essentially, if you apply energy, or essentially, we'll talk about the adenosine triphosphate to diphosphate cycle, and where energy is added and where it's released. But essentially, through that process, we have a motion of actin and myosin, and a repeated bonding, and then releasing, that causes a shortening of this unit, which we call a sarcomere, right? So sarcomere, I put it up there to make sure you really saw it. So the sarcomere represents one actin myosin period. And so we've got actin, myosin, actin, myosin, actin, myosin. They all kind of ratchet over each other during contraction. And sarcomeres, you can think of them as like springs in series. They're also in parallel, and that's what makes, the strength of a muscle is the number of, fibers, fibrils in parallel. But the way that the length of a muscle contracts has a lot to do with the number of sarcomeres in series there. All right, so I think I've got a video on the next, hello, okay. We got ahead of us. All right, so okay. So this is where we're gonna get to ATP and ADP and all that. Okay, so in subtopic 13.2, I'm gonna talk about the respiratory system, as in my lungs taking in Earth's atmosphere, absorbing some of the content of that atmosphere to be used to generate energy inside my body. And it's oxygen that we're extracting, right? But that process of chemical conversion and of carrying oxygen to my cells and removing carbon dioxide waste byproduct to refresh all of this metabolic cycle, that is called respiration. So our respiratory system is really about the system that provides a refreshing energy, a refreshment of the energy at the cells. That's a broader way to refer to it. Okay, so here's what happens. I'm going to show you a video here shortly, but just so you know the main players. We've got adenosine triphosphate, and it releases a phosphate when there is energy release. And so, where is that video? Did I skip? Oh, that's where it is. We got skipped over. So let's watch the video, then I'll come back to that. Sorry. Okay. So watch the video. And again, we've got actin and myosin. We've got in a sarcomere, and we've got sarcomeres in series. But watch the general conversion of adenosine triphosphate to adenosine diphosphate. All right, here we go.
We move our bodies by contracting skeletal muscle. While the results of this action are plain to see, the mechanism behind the action is not. Contraction of skeletal muscle tissue occurs when actin and myosin myofilaments slide past one another, causing the sarcomere to shorten. It is important to note that the individual myofilaments do not change length themselves, but instead overlap each other to shorten the sarcomere. Moving in for a closer look, we can see the details of how this occurs. The molecules you see here are myosin, which at rest has both adenine diphosphate and phosphate molecules attached at the individual myosin heads, actin, tropomyosin, and troponin. When we decide to move, calcium is released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. These molecules bind with the troponin molecules. This causes the tropomyosin molecules to move, revealing myosin attachment sites on the actin myofilaments. The single phosphate attached to the myosin heads gets released as the heads move to connect with the attachment sites on the actin. The resulting formation is called a cross bridge. The remaining adenine diphosphate molecule is then expended in what is called a power stroke, when the myosin heads pull the actin inward. Once the adenine diphosphate attachment is spent, adenine triphosphate molecules attach themselves to the myosin heads. These molecules trigger the release of the myosin heads from the actin attachment sites and are immediately broken down into adenine diphosphate and a single phosphate as the heads move back into their resting position. This is called the recovery stroke. If calcium is still present, the cycle will repeat again, and the sarcomere will continue to shorten until the calcium ions are transported back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum and the muscle relaxes.
So there you go. You can watch the credits if you want later. This is where I got that video. All right. I already explained respiration, but then once again, now in the context of that video, the adenosine diphosphate triphosphate chemical reaction is where the energy is released and reabsorbed and stored. And it really is the key to that ratcheting between the actin and myosin that produces the kinetic energy. So again, just kind of summarizing from the video, the chemical, the adenosine plus 3 phosphates, one of those phosphates is released and is loose in the reticulum. The energy causes the ratcheting of actin and myosin. We have contraction. In order to refresh this is like a spent battery, so to speak, an ADP. It's going to be key in keeping the engine running, but it needs to be re-energized. That's where our metabolism comes in. And so the energy plus a phosphate come from 2 primary sources. We also have a few other details around this, but the 2 primary sources of the energy and the phosphate, really the energy that's needed to recombine a phosphate to ADP to make it a ready to fire, a chemical gas molecule again. I think of it like gasoline, like boom, it fires. Oh, now it's, I don't know, empty liquid. We got to put more fuel back into it and fire it back up again. I don't know. However you think of it, it's this chemical conversion that happens cyclically. So adding that energy back in through our metabolic processes, either aerobic or anaerobic. Aerobic means oxygen is present. And this is a much more efficient and really the preferred way that your body regenerates, energy. So we need oxygen, right? So think about as soon as I start working a little bit harder than just sitting here, I maybe need to breathe a little more deeply. I maybe need to breathe a little more regularly. That's my body increasing the oxygen intake to be able to produce slightly more, slightly higher levels of activity in terms of the supplied energy. If I don't have oxygen, or I don't have enough oxygen because I'm really pushing myself to the limit, that's where we have other sources, and they do not rely on oxygen presence, called anaerobic respiration. So glycolysis is the term of, it breaks down glucose into byproducts. If oxygen is part of that equation, we get carbon dioxide. If oxygen is not part of that equation, we get lactic acid, which may be something you've heard about. I'll talk a little more when we get to it. Okay, another part of this chemical process here is creatine phosphate. I don't fully understand this, but I think of creatine phosphate as like extra phosphates hanging around in that space, so more readily absorbed by or more readily combined with ADP to make ATP. I do know that creatine supplements are used by athletes, bodybuilders, and 1990s era professional Major League Baseball players to build muscle. Maybe not only creatine, but it does have an effect on prolonging your energy or prolonging your muscles' ability to perform, because it's kind of like providing more energy in the space in and around the muscles, that's needed for those contractions. So it doesn't exactly make you stronger, but it makes you last longer in terms of before you would completely fatigue the muscles. All right. Okay, so the two main, I'm gonna say aerobic metabolism, anaerobic metabolism. I'm trying my best to color code them to help you keep them straight, because reading anaerobic and reading aerobic really fast, you can miss two key letters and get it completely opposite. So I try to color code to help with this. And aerobic means oxygen is present, and the blood, when blood is receiving oxygen, we'll talk about this in 13.2, I guess, but it is redder. So if you want to think of red as oxygen-rich blood, maybe that helps. That's how I think of it. And blue as deoxygenated blood. And that's what I've got for the anaerobic descriptor. So anyway, we've introduced this already. The idea of aerobic metabolism is carbohydrates, fatty acids, and oxygen is part of a chemical reaction in which energy is released, or in the presence of, energy is combined with oxygen, and this in the reformation of ATP, the byproduct is carbon dioxide. So again, when we exhale and there's carbon dioxide in our breath, that is a sign of our engines running appropriately. We are exhausting the waste product of aerobic metabolism. Okay, now in the world of calories, energy input, maybe some of you knew this. I don't think I knew this before I started teaching on it, and I was like, wow, why is that? But in general, in our casual conversation, when we say that food has so many calories, like this chocolate bar has 161 calories, this is most of your daily calories for a day, let's say. This is a misnomer, because actually what's really measured here are kilocalories, so 1,000 times that. And this is in terms of the units of calorie as an energy, as a unit of energy, like joules. So 1 kilocalorie is equal to 4.184 kilojoules. Why they don't say kilocalories, I don't know. I really don't. I think it's confusing. But this is what we mean in general. So you can look at this and say, all right, 1390, and then according to what we'll talk about in 13.3, subtopic 13.3, there are certain calories per minute requirements for certain types of jobs. So you might look at this and say, yeah, that'll, if I'm doing my jackhammer job, this will get me through about 6 hours of that job in terms of the added energy I will need above my just staying alive basal metabolism rate. All right, so kilocalories, that's actually what's going on. Hey, that's a good thing for me to put on a quiz, by the way. It's this difference between calories and kilocalories. Okay. Oh yes, by the way, we have our own internal storage unit. So if we can't always get, a chocolate bar for energy, good news is we can store within our own human bodies, and human body fat has roughly 3,500 kilocalories per pound. So, when you think about, the standard 2,000, 2,500 calorie diet, per day, that is, that's like essentially more than 1 pound of body fat per day, is essentially what your body is burning. Just to put that in perspective. Okay, so yes, we've seen this ATP ADP cycle, and it's a good thing to note, that we don't have a whole lot of energy on hand at any given time, but what we're constantly doing is spending our battery and then recharging it. Okay, so we don't have a lot of capacity for producing energy without this metabolic process recharging things. Okay, so we only have about 1 kilocalorie at any given time ready to execute. Okay, and so a little bit more in the creatine phosphate molecules. Again, I don't fully understand how those play a role, but they're part of this equation too. Bottom line is we don't have enough with just these sources to do very much. We can do about 1 minute of moderate activity. Maybe if I'm, exerting myself to my maximum extent, I can do that for about 10 seconds. And then unless I've got metabolic processes running, I'm just going to fall over dead, right? That'll just be it. So it's not very long, right? So these metabolic processes really got to be going all the time. And if oxygen is not present in the metabolic process to the extent that we need, then we got to tap into our other sources of metabolism. Okay, so aerobic metabolism, and I'm showing, like an aerobic workout thing. But even in these cases, you are likely to need some amount of anaerobic metabolism, because this is basically what we tap into when we don't have quite enough to keep up casually by just being at rest and breathing. Okay, so once we have a little bit of a moderate activity, not like walking, but maybe like power walking, brisk walking, and where you can notice the transition is if you run out of breath. That's an indication that, if I have to catch my breath, that's an indication that you've tapped into your non-oxygen sources and you have to pay back the oxygen debt. And if you get any sort of soreness, so anytime we're doing weight training, you're generally tapping into some of these anaerobic energy sources. And the byproduct here, I think I mentioned earlier, is lactic acid. So carbon dioxide comes from aerobic metabolism. Lactic acid is the byproduct of providing energy back to ATP to reform ATP, and the byproduct is lactic acid. Lactic acid isn't removed from the tissue and exhaled like carbon dioxide is. It stays in and around the muscle tissue, and it makes our muscles sore. So when we talk about, ooh, I'm sore from that workout, what you're feeling is, at least in large part, is the lactic acid, which in and around those muscle fibers is now just kind of part of that chemical soup, lactic acid, as a byproduct of anaerobic glycolysis. And that lactic acid stays there until more oxygen can be delivered to essentially neutralize it. And sometimes it gets kind of trapped in there, in and among the muscle fibers. You can't easily get to it to neutralize it. And so then that's why, these things like stretching helps, because you're kind of freeing, you're moving the muscle fibers in and around the lactic acid to kind of free up some of it. massage, that's a reason why deep muscle massage helps, is because you're helping free that lactic acid to be, again, neutralized in the presence of oxygen. But yes, this is also where we start to feel fatigue. When we feel sore, tired in our muscles, that's another indication of lactic acid buildup. Okay, our human metabolism is not very efficient in terms of turning, consumed chemical energy and turning it into kinetic energy. Only about 20% of that becomes, available for kinetic energy. Most of it is heat. Most of it is a thermal heat conversion, which is, the way that the human body needs to be at a certain temperature to function. Then that's good use of our metabolism, right? In general, for performing work, the aerobic metabolism is limited, but much, much more efficient. So I could walk 20 miles, but I would, and I could stay in an aerobic for the most part, maybe not 20 miles, let's say 5 miles. I could walk 5 miles at a easygoing pace, and I could, by the end of that, feel just fine, right? I could feel like I'm not sore, I'm not particularly fatigued. I mean, maybe not 5 miles even, but there you can, if you stay at a certain pace, you can go a very long time. Okay, and that's, again, we're just continually refreshing our metabolic cycle. Once I got to go a little bit above that pace, I got to start tapping into the lactic acid producing. It's like I'm flooring it. I'm giving the throttle everything it's got. I'm not going to have the best fuel efficiency, but I am going to get the most power that I need, for a moment of time. Another aspect of this is the aerobic metabolism really requires the delivery of oxygen to the cells. So in order to get a nice oxygen molecule all the way to the tip of my finger, I got to have well-functioning oxygen exchange at my lungs and a well-functioning cardiac and circulatory system to basically take those oxygenated blood that's received from the lungs and then send it all the way out here. So this is why, warm-up activities are good before long stretches of physical activity, because you're essentially preparing your aerobic metabolism. It's like warming up the car in the morning so that it all runs smoothly. I don't know, maybe that's not a thing unless you lived in cold environments. But if you've ever lived in Michigan or a cold environment where you got to start your car in the morning and let it go for 5 minutes before you try to drive it, otherwise it'll die because it's that cold. This is a similar sort of analogy. All right, there we go. So yes, if you're feeling soreness, again, this is a good sign that you've needed to push past that aerobic metabolism into anaerobic sources. It's not a bad thing. We're all sore all the time for things, but that's the source of it, right? If we are then, having a lot of lactic oxygen or lactic acid in our, muscles as part of this anaerobic metabolism, we basically make that up by adding excess oxygen back into the system. So this is why, if I just go out and do, let's say, 50, 100 push-ups, no big deal. But let's say I do a reasonable amount of push-ups, and I am, I'm out of breath. I stop doing the push-ups, so I no longer need to produce the, kilocalories per minute rate of energy that the push-ups required. I'm done. I'm sitting back on the bench, but I'm still breathing hard. I'm still needing to catch my breath. And this is an indication that your body is recovering. You have an oxygen debt, as we put here, as in you got to add extra oxygen to offset that lactic acid that's been built up. And again, yes, muscle sorts of massage to help free up that lactic acid, to expose it to the oxygen that might be coming in if you're breathing hard. So I mentioned already, there are very commonly activities are going to require a little bit of each of these types of activities or of metabolism. Aerobic metabolism is good for long-term, low-impact Once you got to do something like open the pickle jar to exert yourself to the maximum point, for a short burst, you're mostly going to be using anaerobic sources. And it's not like you have a choice, but anytime you are doing that, you have just engaged, even for a short period of time, an anaerobic source. And that is a very efficient short burst sort of way that your body uses that energy. So if you can see over time, aerobic energy much more efficient. Not anaerobic is not, but anaerobic is going to get you, that burst energy. And I think I already mentioned this, but yes, this is why we warm up. 1 to 3 minutes to get the heart beating, so you're get the vasculature dilated or constricted in such a way that with a comfortable heart rate, you are getting enough oxygenation at your fingertips. And so this is why we we'll warm up our circulatory respiratory systems. And we'll talk about those in 13.2. So thanks. That's it for this topic.